Welcome to the CATO Institute. I'd like to offer a special welcome also for our viewers on C-SPAN who will be joining us now and later. My name is John Samples. I'm Director of the Center for Representative Government here at the CATO Institute. Our forum today concerns a new book, Not Invited to the Party, How the Demopublicans Have Rigged the System and Left Independents Out in the Cold. Let me begin by giving you some framework and some ideas about today's event. We will hear from our speakers first for about an hour or so, and then that will be followed by a question and answer period from the audience. Around 1:30 or so, we shall break for lunch when you'll have an additional chance to talk with the authors and the speakers about the issues raised in today's forum. I am also admonished by our staff here that I should respectfully request that you turn off your cell phones, and that means turn them off so we don't get that, quote, weird buzzing sound on the television. Thank you very much for that. So to our event. The CATO Institute, as many of you may know, stands for Individual Liberty and Limited Government. Competition offers a means to these ends. Competition in markets expresses liberty and creates choices. Electoral competition offers alternatives to voters and constrains government to the popular will, and indeed, as James Madison himself well understood. Classical liberals will thus be skeptical of government efforts to suppress electoral competition by fostering or protecting any party or the two major parties in the United States today. We should also say that third parties in other countries are associated with systems of proportional representation, and that in those systems we can see, for example, that classical liberalism has what would one say is a pure form of representation. I'm thinking, for example, of the Free Democrats in Germany, who sometimes hold power in that country, hold significant offices in that country, and really bring a libertarian vision to meet with public policy and law in that nation. In the end, classical liberals are likely to say, I think, though we'll hear more today about this, that more competition is better than less, and that government control over electoral competition is unlikely to serve the cause of liberty in the long run. Consequently, third parties in the American system, their access to the ballot and to the electoral system, are worth talking about, and that's what we're going to do today. Our first speaker will be our author, Jim Bennett. Jim is an eminent scholar at George Mason University and holds the William Snavely Chair of Political Economy and Public Policy in the Department of Economics and is director of the Olin Institute for Employment Practice and Policy. He received his PhD in 1970 from Case Western Reserve and has specialized in research related to public policy issues, the economics of government and bureaucracy, labor unions, and health charities. He is founder and editor of the Journal of Labor Research and has published more than 60 articles in professional journals such as the American Economic Review, Public Choice, and others. He has written many books, of which I shall mention one to you. He is the author of Destroying Democracy, How Government Funds Partisan Politics, published by the CATO Institute in 1986. I'll ask you please to welcome Jim Bennett, our author today.
Thanks much, John. And thanks to our host here at CATO, Dave Bose, who was a little bit surprised when he learned that Ralph Nader had written a foreword to this book. My credentials suddenly crumbled. But that's all right. And afterward was written by Bill Redpath, who is chair of the Libertarian National Committee. So I'm sandwiched between the two extremes of the political spectrum, and I think it's a great thing. Something's got to be seriously wrong, folks, when you've got Ralph Nader praising my work on the one hand and Bill Redpath on the other. As John mentioned, I'm a professor of economics at George Mason, and we pride ourselves on our specialty in the field of what's called public choice. This is the economics of politics. And I came to this issue because of the fact that I began to notice that Candidates other than Democrats and Republicans, despite the excitement that they started with, soon faded in the political arena and were not really considered seriously by the time the elections arose. And I began to wonder what was going on. And as an academic, of course, one of the first things that you do is you say, well, what else has been done in this field? And I found very little has been done by the political science fraternity, or the political science academics. And apparently, to political sciences, the domination of politics by the Demopublicans, what I call the Democrats and Republicans, you may recall that, or at least I do, I'm old enough, and that's why I'm using notes, that George Wallace, in his campaign in 1968, pointed out that there's not a dime's worth of Democrats between the Republicans and the Democrats, and so that's why I call them the Demopublicans. And it's to the political science community, apparently, having the Demopublicans dominate the field is not only how things are, but also how they should be. And I take exception to that. And it seems many voters also have apparently come to the conclusion that voting for candidates outside the Demopublicans is somehow suspect, if not unpatriotic or even subversive. So we need new approaches to problems. We need more issues put before the American voters. We need to widen the range of political debate, and that's what these third parties and so on have done. Third parties have traditionally challenged the status quo, and they have led to change and new ideas and so on. And throughout our nation's history, particularly before the Civil War, we had really dozens of different parties. Some interesting names, just to throw them out quickly: the Mugwumps, the Anti-Masons, the Know-Nothings, Bull Moose, and of course more recently the Conservative Party, the Libertarians, the Greens, the Reform Party, and so on and so forth. Many of these parties had good ideas. The Liberty Party, for example, was abolitionist and opposed slavery. Some of them have ideas that aren't so good. For example, we had the Prohibition Party, and you can imagine what their agenda was. So early in the nation's history, we had many parties, rough and tumble politics, and, by the way, a very high rate of turnout in elections. What happened to change all of this? Elections and virtually all political discourse is now dominated by the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, being a libertarian, one of the first things I do is to go to that document that a lot of people don't put a lot of credence in today, which is the Constitution of the United States, and ask, what does it say about political parties? And the answer is nothing. However, in the debate about the Constitution, Federalist Papers and our patriots such as James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and so on, a great deal was said about the notion of faction. Faction, in today's terminology, is special interest, and political parties were considered to be special interest who wanted to use the power of the state to benefit themselves and their members. Even today, surveys have shown throughout the world deep public distrust of political parties everywhere. In polling, political parties are ranked in public esteem lower than lawyers. Yes, lower than lawyers. That tells you something. Nevertheless, we have political parties, and by the end of the Civil War, the Dems and the Republicans were entrenched as the two major political parties, a duopoly controlling politics. How did this occur? There's a number of reasons, and I will talk about four. First was the elimination of multi-member districts. At-large elections were sharply restricted by the Apportionment Act of 1842 that required congressmen to be elected in single-member districts so that candidates winning the most votes is the sole representative. French sociologist Maurice Duverger showed that the simple majority single ballot system strongly favors two parties. This is a phenomenon known as Duverger's law. Voting for a long-shot candidate who might prevail as third or fourth choice in a multi-member election is widely viewed today as throwing away one's vote in a winner-take-all system. So it discourages single-member districts, discourages voting for third parties and independent candidates. And incidentally, I might add, the Electoral College's winner-take-all practice also encourages the two-party system. Politically, however, single-member districts make some sense in today's world. You can think of, for example, the concern of people in upstate New York about being dominated by the people in Manhattan, and so on and so forth. Now, the second, and in my view the most important impediment to third parties, is the so-called government reform. You know, when libertarians hear that government is being reformed by politicians, we always grab our wallets. And the idea of the Australian ballot is that the government will print and provide the ballots. Prior to the 1890s, ballots were privately printed by the parties themselves, so that any party could print up a ballot with any slate of candidates that they wanted. But in the 1890s, in response to a lot of corruption that occurred in the 1888 elections, governments began to supply a single consolidated ballot for all candidates for all offices. This was the Australian ballot. And by 1910, only 2 states did not use the Australian ballot. By the way, one of those, South Carolina, permitted the use of private ballots up until about 1950. Control of the ballot by government allowed government to control who gets on the ballot. And a major justification for the Australian ballot is that non-serious candidates can be excluded. As those patronizing, condescending elites who know what is best for the rest of us are well aware, too many choices confuse the voters. So we have to, look after the voters to avoid confusion there. The major parties never had never did and still don't have a problem getting their candidates on the ballot because access is based on the number of votes received in the previous election. But candidates and parties outside the duopoly have serious impediments due to ballot access laws. Some states require tens of thousands of valid signatures on petitions just to appear on the state ballot. In Oklahoma, in 2008, for example, more than 40,000 signatures were required just to appear on the ballot. And the emphasis here is on the word valid. The slightest discrepancy can have not only a name thrown out, but a whole page of petitions. For example, John introduced me as Jim Bennett, and if I put down my name as James T. Bennett and my address and then signed it Jim Bennett, that would be considered, a bad and an invalid petition signing. Failing to dot an I, failing to cross a T, all these kinds of things can invalidate whole pages. So the real issue is you probably need 10 or 20% more than the minimum in order to be assured to get on the ballot. And the Democrats and the Republicans, each election, hire lawyers and so on to challenge these petitions. And the third-party candidate needs to, of course, hire counsel to oppose the counsel that the duopoly brings to bear on the problem. Stringent access laws spread like wildfire in the 1930s to thwart the Communist Party candidates, although the Communist Party was never a serious contender in any election. But the same restrictions that applied to the Communist Party also applied to the third parties and the independent candidates, but certainly not to the Democrats and the Republicans. Put simply, clearing the hurdles throughout the nation merely to get on the ballot often exhausts both the energies and the resources of independent candidates and third parties. In the 2008 elections, over 1.5 million valid signatures were needed if a third party was to appear on the ballot in every state in the Union. Couple these onerous petition requirements with early filing deadlines, and for the Democrats and the Republicans are on the ballot by definition, so they don't worry about filing deadlines. But when you are submitting petitions, they often have to be presented weeks or months in advance of the time that prior to the printing of the ballots. So this also imposes serious expense and difficulties for the people outside of the duopoly. Third-party candidates are often viewed as spoilers, out to deny the Democrats and the Republicans their rightful offices. Witness, for example, the scorn heaped on Ralph Nader, who was inappropriately blamed for denying the inventor of the Internet the presidency. In truth, ballot clutter really has never occurred. And after all, even kooks who want to be on the ballot have some rights, at least they did under the Constitution. What has been sold to the American public as a good government measure is simply a way to eliminate political competition at the ballot box. There are other laws that the Demo-Publicans have passed as well to impede and, if not eliminate, challengers. So-called sore loser laws prevent those who lost in a primary from then running as an independent and taking votes away from the party on which that they ran in the primary. Anti-fusion laws prevent having a candidate endorsed by multiple parties, which would benefit independent candidacies. The Republicans and the Democrats, however, don't ever fuse. By enacting such laws, the Demo-Publicans have used the power of government to stifle and oppress third parties and independent candidates. Little wonder that turnout is so low that we typically have, because we typically have only a realistic choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledummer at the ballot box. A third impediment, and I have to use that word again, is campaign reform. Again, anytime you hear that politicians are reforming something, the news for the general public is inevitably bad. Money is the lifeblood of politics. Taxpayer funding of campaigns and even conventions also benefits the Democrats and the Republicans. Federal law limits contributions by individuals, thus squelching the possibility that an independent might make an effective run for office with just a couple of well-heeled backers. With government money, however, come strings, and these strings inevitably benefit the duopoly. And they, of course, impede challengers. The good government side of campaign reform is just another way of privileging the elite over outsiders and protecting the status quo. All these so-called limits were neatly skirted with loopholes. PAC contributions where PACs arose, soft money, and all that kind of stuff. Corporations, always looking for welfare handouts from government, have little interest in independents and third parties. Both the left and the right, in other words, Ralph and Bill Redpath down here, by the way, they're sitting on opposite sides of the room, that may tell you something, are opposed, in my opinion. They agree on one thing, certainly, and that is the ending of corporate welfare. But anyway, the vast majority of taxpayer dollars allocated for politics have naturally enriched the Demo-Publicans. The only candidate who actually got a significant sum was Ross Perot in 1996, who got roughly 1/8 of the $234 million distributed. But third parties and independents, even if they do get tax funds for their political campaigns, they get it after the election. So you need to get at least 5% of the vote in order to get any federal money. And of course, you have to have the election before you can determine whether you get 5% of the vote. So the simple fact is that, TV time bought in December when the election was in November is not terribly helpful. And by the way, of course, incumbents in office, which are typically the Democrats and the Republicans, already have enormous advantages over challengers. Things like the congressional frank, constituent newsletters, access to the media, gerrymandering and districts, and so on. In short, the Republican version of campaign finance reform is little more than an incumbent protection act to exclude outsiders. The fourth impediment involves the media. Here we have a self-fulfilling prophecy. The media refuses to give serious news coverage to independents because they're unlikely to win. And of course, independents are unlikely to win because the Republicans have used the power of government to harass them at every turn and minimize their participation in the election process, which excludes them from media coverage. If you can't get your views and positions out to the public and make yourself known, you certainly aren't going to get elected. In yet another of those good government moves, the Republicans established the Commission on Presidential Debates in 1987 to decide who will appear and the rules for participating. Guess who co-chairs this group? It's headed by the former chairman of the Democratic and the former chairman of the Republican National Committees. So you can bet your last nickel that the commission has little interest in bringing new ideas and non-duopoly candidates to the general public. To participate, you had to get 15% of the vote in the previous election, which of course guarantees a role for the Democrat and the Republican candidate. But other candidates were shut out. And incidentally, even getting 15% doesn't guarantee you too much when the Republicans are there, because Ross Perot got 19%, and in 1976 was denied access to the debates, even though he got well over the limit in 1992. Hey, hypocrisy is not the strong point. Is not a serious consideration when it comes to political maneuverings. And we can talk a little bit about the United States signing the Copenhagen document of the Helsinki Accords, which talks about political freedoms that require a clear separation between the state and political parties. Yeah, right. And the signatories agree to respect the right of citizens to seek political or public office individually or as a representative of political parties without discrimination. Yeah, right. Well, as I mentioned before, hypocrisy is not a serious problem when it comes to politics. And I'll just note, by the way, that in Iran, in the last presidential election, they had some 7 candidates, and of course we're pointing the finger at us for the way we do things. Now, in my book, I discuss in some detail the role of third-party and independent candidates in the 2008 election, and more accurately, their almost unfortunate non-role in that election. And I briefly survey how other developed countries conduct elections. It's sufficient at this point to say that virtually everywhere parties are increasingly become a part of the apparatus of the state through subsidies. However, ballot access laws are typically nowhere near as severe as those here in the so-called land of the free. Now, let me wrap up, because there are people here who've had a lot more experience with this in a hands-on sense that I do, and I think that, they should have time. Like I say, I'm an ivory tower academic. But I'd like to suggest what should be done. First, I'll talk about ideally what I would like to see done. Ideally, we need to dramatically reduce the size and scope of government. We need to sharply reduce its powers and the privileges it hands out. We need to slash government spending and transfer payments. To be honest, in my view, a great deal of what the government does at all levels is simply unconstitutional. A limited government would mean that who actually serves in government doesn't matter very much. And the incentives to restrict participation in elections would also decline markedly. We would benefit by taking some lessons on government from the Swiss. The typical Swiss citizen can't tell you who the president is because it really doesn't matter that much. Now, having advanced my ideal solution, I must admit that it has about the same likelihood of being adopted as the likelihood that I'm struck by a meteorite on the way home from this event. And if we try to repeal the operation of divergence law by having multi-member district, that is an appealing idea, but it's unlikely to happen simply because of the differences between, say, rural districts and urban districts and so on and so forth. And it's also unlikely that we're going to be able to ever return to the privately printed paper ballots. A lot of this has to do with what happened down in Florida. Realistically, what we need to do is to deregulate the election process, get government out of politics. First, repeal all ballot access laws. Modern technology, it seems to me, can cope with many candidates. In the unlikely event that suddenly everyone wants to run for the presidency or public office, we could set reasonable limits for ballot access. Say, you have to get 500 signatures and have a modest filing fee, say $2,500 or so, and have the filing fee refundable if you get, say, 1,000 votes, whatever. Repeal sore loser and anti-fusion laws. 3, repeal all restrictions on campaign finance. All donations would be legal, despite the source of the amount. But I would suggest we require prompt and public disclosure on the internet. Under my scheme, politicians could still be bought, but we would know at least who was doing the buying. End all party subsidies for the taxpayer. And I think Bill Redpath, in his afterward, has a wonderful idea about initiating instant runoff voting. Instead of picking just one candidate for office, voters would express their preference by ranking candidates 1, 2, 3. If no clear majority at the outset, the person on the bottom's vote would be transferred to other candidates. Now, this would give a great deal of interest in independent candidates because of the fact that the public would be interested in these people. And in addition, another major blessing would be that it would probably reduce greatly negative campaigning. For those of us who live in this area, I've heard more about a 20-year-old master's thesis than I want to even talk about. So those are basically my suggestions. And John has given me a thing saying I have 1 minute. So before, I'm accused of aggression or something, which is against libertarian principles, I'll sit down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before turning to Theresa, I wanted to mention, single out or recognize 3 of our distinguished guests today. First, as was mentioned, Ralph Nader, who ran as a third-party presidential candidate twice, at least. Ralph's been coming to CATO. I've seen him. This is the second time in just a couple of months. You keep doing that, Ralph. Either you're going to become a libertarian, or we're going to become Naderites. And I don't know which one. Both will happen. And mentioning Bill Redpath, the National Libertarian Party, is here also. Welcome. And finally, Christina Tobin of the Free and Equal Elections Organization. Now, if you live in California and vote in California, you might want to keep the name Christina Tobin in mind as time passes. I should say that doesn't constitute an endorsement of the Cato Institute. It's simply a rogue element at the Cato Institute exercising freedom of speech. I live in a deep fear of violating campaign finance laws somehow. Theresa Amato is the author of Grand Illusion, our next book, and she will be our next speaker, The Myth of Voter Choice in a Two-Party Tyranny. She was the National Presidential Campaign Manager and in-house counsel for Ralph Nader in 2000 and 2004. Ms. Amato graduated from Harvard University and New York University Law School. She founded the Citizen Advocacy Center in suburban Chicago and works with many nonprofit organizations. She has been a fellow also at Harvard's Institute of Politics at the JFK School and a Wasserstein Public Interest Law Fellow at the Harvard Law School. A very fine speaker on this topic, Theresa Amato.
Good afternoon, and thank you, John Samples, and thank you, CATO Institute, for hosting a forum on ballot access and on the important discussion we're hearing today. Thank you, all of you, for coming, because this is quite a turnout to hear about systemic barriers to entry for third parties and independents in the political process. It's not the kind of thing that makes the front page of the major newspapers every day, and it's very nice of you to share in this and for this to be covered. So I'd like to encourage other think tanks and the media to host these kinds of discussions, because this is one of those topics you don't hear quite often enough. And let me say congratulations to Jim Bennett for producing an excellent book. You have a copy here, and I'm going to hold it up again, because I read Jim Bennett's book, and first thing I noticed was in the first paragraph or so, he said he took a swipe at lawyers, as you heard here, and I thought, uh-oh. And then later on, he makes a crack about Harvard-trained people, and I thought, uh-oh. And then, of course, throughout the book, he kind of poo-poos goo-goos, as he calls them, people who work for good government, and I thought, gee, I spent my whole life doing that. And so when I read Jim's book, I thought, gee, I am Jim Bennett's perfect nightmare. And except for two things. One, I agree with the major premise of his book, and that is that the system is rigged. It's rigged against the two parties, or rather, it's rigged in favor of the two parties to keep out challengers and competition from minor parties and independent candidates. And second, unlike most academicians, I have had the experience of being in the arena twice, once for a minor party presidential candidate when Ralph Nader chose to run on the Green Party ticket in 2000, and once as presidential national campaign manager for an independent, and that's when Ralph Nader chose to run again in 2004, despite all of the hullabaloo and outcry against his right to present his views to the American people. And so I really, unlike most people on the planet, because once you've run a national presidential campaign, you will never do it again, if you're sane, have had this experience twice. So I have the battle scars, and I know how difficult it is firsthand in order to be able to present alternative choices, more voices to the American people every 4 years when we host a national presidential election. So I would have probably agreed with 90% of what Jim Bennett said up until the last 5 minutes, and that's where we may diverge in, and I'm sure we do, in solutions. But he has laid out really part of the problem. So I think what I will do instead is tell you some of the firsthand experiences we had. And I'll start in February of 2000. Ralph Nader called me up, and he said, well, would you like to run my presidential campaign? And I said, well, Ralph, you know, I was in the middle of Illinois working for a nonprofit, and I said, Ralph, you know, the last campaign I ran was for student council. And he said, that's all right, because this is going to be a very different kind of campaign. This is going to be a citizens campaign. We're going to run with the people, and we're going to put all the issues that are not talked about by the two major parties on the table so that people have a chance to communicate and talk about the things that are routinely shut out from the national debate every time we have an election. And I thought about it, and I thought what he was trying to do, because he had spent 4 decades in Washington, and he knew what the score was and how difficult it was for citizens to make concrete change in Washington, D.C. He had seen the government overrun by lobbyists and being marinated in corporate campaign cash, and he had also a personal history of being able to open the process up, and I thought, well, if there were ever a time, this would be the time to do it. So I get to Washington, and, you know, I consider myself fairly well-read. I read the newspapers every day. I majored in government and economics. I went to law school. I thought, how hard can this be? And then reality set in. You know, we all grow up under this myth that anyone can run and be president of the United States, right? This is the national lore. But if you try to be anyone and you're not the party favorite of one of the two major parties, woe to you. It is nearly impossible to run an effective national presidential campaign outside of the two-party system. And that's because we have systemic barriers. Even if you have a supremely qualified candidate, even if you have popular support, we have systemic barriers that have made it difficult to compete, and there is no level playing field. So when Jim Bennett writes in his book, "The System is Rigged and Nobody Cares," I know what of he speaks. Let's start with ballot access. Well, actually, let's start with the regulatory system. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading 11 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations for Campaign Finance, I suggest you do so. As one person I interviewed at the Federal Election Commission explained to me, it's like asking a lawyer, or rather, I said, well, I'm a lawyer, you know, I'll be able to figure this out. And he said, well, no, it's really like asking a general practitioner, a doctor, to perform brain surgery, and you have to learn all of this while you're doing your other job 24/7. It is extremely difficult to navigate the regulatory curlicues, and even though even the people who work at the Federal Election Commission don't agree on what is in the Federal Election Commission Code, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that from our next speaker. Worse, if you call up for information, you find out the standard pat answer, and it really is a supremely competent and talented information division. It's not their fault. It's just that the regulations aren't written for third parties and independent candidates, and oftentimes they have no idea what the answer is as applied to third parties and independent candidates. So they will say, Ms. Amato, the code is silent. So you have to go and ask for an advisory opinion, and that could take months when you really needed the answer yesterday. That's one problem. The other problem is that people don't agree on what the code says. And, of course, the third problem is that really the code is not written for a grassroots kind of campaign. In fact, somebody at the FEC actually told me when I tried to paint a hypothetical that, you know, these laws aren't written for a grassroots campaign. I thought, gee, there's a big problem right there. So it's extraordinarily difficult if you don't come with a cottage industry of lawyers, people who are savvy in how these laws have been applied, and a fundamental background understanding, and really a standing mechanism or vehicle like a major party in order to navigate the regulatory framework. That having been said, I think that needs to be improved. I would not agree to get rid of it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The major hurdle every third party and independent candidate faces is 51 different ballot access laws. Jim painted some of the picture, but the reality and the nightmare is unbelievable, because every single third party candidate and independent will tell you the majority of their resources, all the blood, sweat, and tears, goes to getting on the ballot, because if you're not on the ballot, you're just not a choice. And this is a system set. These ballot laws, it's very important to note, are written by who? The Democrats and the Republicans who occupy the General Assemblies and those state legislatures in every one of the states. And so even though some of the states are quite reasonable, other states are off the charts, and they make it intentionally difficult, not only on the facial application, but if you actually try to follow through and submit these kind of signatures. Let's just start with the regulatory mechanism. First, and I don't know why we continue to do this, but we have irrationally 13,000 election jurisdictions overseeing are federal elections. And so you have a problem with, you have all these different jurisdictions, the knowledge varies wildly, and even if you call the states, the Secretary of State or the Attorney General's office or the Office of the Board of Elections or whoever, whichever entity is regulating the elections in a particular state, frequently you get something like, they're not going to tell you what their law means. First of all, some of them don't know what their law says. Second, they are embarrassed that their laws on their books are patently unconstitutional and have been held such by the courts, but they can't get their general assemblies to actually change the law so that it comports with what the current legal status is. And so you have to divine all of this. And third, oftentimes they're very afraid that they might be sued, and so they don't want to tell you anything. Now, of course, this is very helpful if you want to run for office. The second reality is that these laws, when you aggregate them across the 50 states and the District of Columbia, as an aggregate burden, makes it virtually impossible for individuals who are outside of the two parties in order to be able to compete, because you spend 2/3 of the campaign just getting to the starting point where the major two parties are. So you spend all your resources doing this, and then of course there's all kinds of side effects in terms of whether or not you are considered whether you've committed fraud because Jim instead of James signed, and all of those kinds of little barriers that add up into the collective that it's very rare that you get a candidate who is even able to put his or her name on all 50 ballots. In addition to that, you have a hostile media confronting you. In the case of Ralph's campaign in 2000, there were 3 or 4 New York Times editorials that basically said that he and Pat Buchanan should not even be in the picture. They were, quote, cluttering the field. Just think about that. Since when is political competition cluttering the field? That is the disdain with which the mainstream media looks upon independents and third-party candidates. It's very difficult to get a story. When you do get a story, it's generally about the horse race. How will you affect the chances of one of the two major parties? Not why is it that you're taking on this incredible burden and you want to talk to the American people and have a dialogue? And what is it that you're proposing? It's very rare to get a substantive story on the issues. It's more, how are you going to affect so-and-so's chances? Well, they never ask the Republican candidate, how are you going to affect the Democrats' chances? Yeah, that's a ridiculous question. So why is it posed all the time as the starting opening question for third-party and independent candidates? Media is incredibly hostile, in part because we grow up in a culture of thinking that somehow we have enshrined a two-party system when the word party is not even in the Constitution. And then, of course, the media is a big racket, and so a lot of campaign money actually goes because we don't provide free airtime, even though the airwaves belong to the Commonwealth to candidates. A lot of the campaign money has to go to buying spots, and some of those spots would cost as much as the salary of people I work with for a few minutes, just because it's so expensive to break into the media market. And then finally, if you want to produce your own media, like we did in 2000, then we had the pleasure of being sued because we exercised our free speech rights to parody MasterCard for copyright and trademark infringement, and then had to battle that as well. So in addition to the media, the ballot access, the regulatory scheme, there's also, as Jim alluded to, the Commission on Presidential Debates. It's a very official sounding name, but it's really a private corporation that sits on New Hampshire Avenue and acts as a cartel in terms of which candidates get to reach tens of millions of people each year in order to be able, or each presidential election, in order to be able to put their points to tens of millions of people in watching in any kind of logical fashion. What they do is they take an average of 15. You have to reach 15% in the average of 5 polls in order to be considered qualified, because they made a very bad mistake in 1992. They actually let Ross Perot in the debates, and so they never wanted to repeat that. And as a consequence, you haven't seen a third party or independent candidate in the presidential debates. And so Ralph Nader could have gone to every stadium as he did, like the Fleet Center and or Madison Square Garden, and filled 20,000 people, and you'd never reach even a fraction of the proportion that you would reach on television, of course, with the imprimatur of these are the serious candidates that should be allowed to have a voice in the election. Finally, I want to point out that there is these are the practical problems, but these are really the answer and the solution to these are fundamentally structural. We have a lot of Band-Aid discussion is what I would call what's going on now about election perfection, and there's a reason for that. So in 2000, people perceived, I believe wrongly, that because Ralph Nader received 97,000 votes in Florida and the margin of difference between Al Gore and George Bush was 537 votes, that it was somehow all Mr. Nader's fault that we ended up with George W. Bush. What I'd like to point out is that there were other minor party candidates, in fact 8 on the ballot, and all of them received more than 537 votes. That's not difficult. Of course, there were a number of other factors like Catherine Harris, how we purge voter election rolls, the Florida Supreme Court, the intervention of the United States Supreme Court, and but what happened at the end of the day is it became some kind of a national meme that third parties or independents are quote-unquote spoilers. But it's really, really hard to spoil an already spoiled system. And these are, and it's spoiled because of the structural problems, but what engendered was that one of the two major parties, you can guess which one, the Democratic Party, in 2004 made it its mission to make sure that Ralph Nader would not get on the ballot and brought 24 lawsuits in the period of 12 weeks to try to stifle competition. The Democratic Party or its allies on the ground in a number of states. And so I don't know how many of people here have been sued. Anybody here ever been sued? Yeah, okay, very rare. Well, imagine getting 24 lawsuits in the period of 12 weeks before you had your cup of coffee. Ralph would start opening up debates, waving a service of summons, saying, this is what democracy looks like. Now, that kind of systemic oppression to try to exclude third-party and independent candidates is something we just should never tolerate in this country. I think fundamentally all of the talk that it was created from the 537 vote difference in Florida. A lot of people, the good thing was that people started paying attention to what was going on in their boards of elections. They started thinking about how do we register people to vote? Why is it that we have an opt-in system? Why is it that the local voter rolls don't match the ones in the state capitals? Why is it that there's chaos and everything is done at the last minute to enter new registered voters? Why don't we have same-day registration? What is this system and who's paying attention? Why don't we have uniform standards of what counts as a vote? Isn't it ridiculous we have to be holding up punch cards to the light and seeing if it has 2 hanging chad or 3 or dimpled or pregnant or whatever? And it was really almost a mockery of our system of governance that people looked at all around the world and said, what are they doing there in the United States? How come they can't determine what's a vote? How come they can't determine who's registered to vote? How come they can't determine what grounds constitute proper grounds for an audit or a recount? How come the machines don't work? What is this? Why are we just asking these questions in the 21st century here in our country? But all that election perfection still won't give you an open and equal competition if you don't have some reform to the systemic barriers to third-party and independent candidates. I'm going to stop now so that we can save more time for questions, but I hope you'll ask some. Thank you.
Now that you've heard her, remember it's Grand Illusion by Theresa Amato, available at your bookstore or online, and Not Invited to the Party by James Bennett, which will be available also in both places. Our final commentator today will be Hans A. von Spakovsky, who is Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, where he manages the Civil Justice Reform Initiative. In addition, von Spakovsky studies the legal aspects of elections, including campaign finance, voter fraud, and voter identification laws, and issues arising from registration and equipment. Before joining Heritage in 2008, Hans served for 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission. Previously, he worked at the Justice Department as the counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. He provided expertise and advice on enforcing the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, National Review, and Human Events, among others. He has testified before state and congressional committees and has made presentations to organizations such as the National Association of Secretaries of State, the Federalist Society, the National Council of State Legislatures, and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Hans took a law degree at Vanderbilt University. He received his bachelor's in political science from MIT. Please welcome Hans von Spakovsky.
So I am a lawyer, but I didn't go to Harvard. Does that give me some points? And we used to refer to Harvard when I was at MIT as the little red schoolhouse down the road. I have to say I agree with a lot of things that were said here this morning, particularly when Theresa was talking about how horrible the Federal Election Campaign Act is and how confusing it is and how difficult it makes it for an ordinary person to run for office. In his new book, Professor Bennett outlines many of these problems. He also talks about many of the restrictions on third parties caused by very difficult ballot access laws implemented by the states. He also complains about the federal public funding program, which, as most of you know, was put in place about 30 years ago, and points out the problems with those states like Wisconsin that have put in state versions of public funding for state legislative candidates. Those public funding programs have not achieved any of the supposed purposes that so-called campaign reformers have used to push them. In fact, even under public funding laws, challengers have a harder time knocking off incumbents than I think under a private system. I want to skip to the end of Professor Bennett's book by saying that I agree with many of his conclusions. For example, I agree that restrictive ballot access laws should be relaxed as a matter of fundamental fairness and in the interest of democracy, or in our case, republicanism, since we are a republic and not a democracy in the strictest sense of the word. I believe in competition, something John talked about, and I particularly believe in competition in the political arena. I also think the same thing about anti-fusion laws, and also that the campaign finance law that we have on the federal level also needs to be radically changed. However, I have arguments with some of the things that he says in the book. I mean, for example, you know, the idea that doing all this is going to lead to some sort of renaissance in the American polity or provide a surge of new ideas or policies that are discussed, debated throughout the political world is, I think, an overly optimistic assumption. I also fundamentally disagree with the constant theme expressed throughout the book that there's no difference between the two major parties, that they're simply two sides of the same coin. That would come as quite a surprise to many of the legislators in Congress on the Republican side of the political aisle, who right now and for the last couple of months have been waging quite a fight to try and stop the nationalization of our health care system and the destruction of our economy by the cap and tax system of environmental extremism that's being vigorously pushed by the president and his political party. I think those two issues alone illustrate some very stark differences in the public policy viewpoints of the Republican and Democratic parties, and I find it difficult to agree with the claim that the two parties are bereft of ideas and are simply vehicles that individuals use to achieve political power. There's no doubt there are people in both parties that are like that. But I think that's true of all political parties. But there are also many individual members and candidates in those two parties and in the other independent parties who have fundamentally different outlooks on our Constitution, our government, and our social and economic policies. And I think it's a denial of reality to claim otherwise. Now, critics of my point of view are going to point to some members of the Republican Party, like the two senators from Maine, who far too often vote with the other major party. But there's no party anywhere, and that includes the independent parties, talked about in Professor Bennett's book, like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, whose members agree 100% of the time on all issues, or who never agree with the views on certain issues of members of the other two major political parties. As I said, I also agree with Professor Bennett's description of the Federal Election Campaign Act and the amendments to it embodied in the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, also known as McCain-Feingold, which I had the misfortune to have to try to enforce when I was on the FEC. Now, I've expressed my opinion on this on more than one occasion. I got into big trouble at one of my first hearings that we had when I was on the FEC when I said to a lawyer who was there from Democracy 21, which is one of the big campaign reform organizations, when I compared the passage of the McCain-Feingold law to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And in fact, the fact that I had said that at a hearing was cited against me publicly in the nomination fight I had trying to get onto the FEC. As Dr. Bennett has pointed out, I think the Supreme Court made a fundamental error when it upheld the main parts of the FICA law in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision. And I got to tell you, having been a commissioner for 2 years at the FEC, I think it's a terrible idea to have a federal bureaucracy making decisions on what kind of political activity and what kind of political speech is acceptable or not acceptable under the force of federal law. I think the FICA law has protected incumbents and made it very difficult for ordinary citizens to run for office, as I've said, because it is a Byzantine and confusing law, and even the 6 commissioners who run it often disagree, doing their best as lawyers to try to figure out what the law prohibits and what it doesn't. I also think that the McCain-Feingold law is directly responsible for the huge growth of 527 and other organizations like that, because what it did in 2002 is it imposed a lot of restrictions on the political parties, the money they can get, and the activities they can engage in. And while you may not like particular political parties, there's a lot more responsibility. You know, if you don't like the particular ads that a political party is running, well, there's things you can do. You know, you cannot give money to that political party. You can work against its candidates. It's hard to do that with a 527 organization. I do think, however, that Dr. Bennett makes a mistake in his book because he makes some sweeping generalizations about this area of the law that do a disservice to a lot of very principled individuals that I've actually met and worked with in Washington. You know, he refers to all the commissioners who've served on the FEC as political hacks who only vote the way their political party wants them to. I can tell you that's false. I mean, I know most of the Republican commissioners who served on the FEC, including Bradley Smith, who I replaced, and in fact, Dr. Bennett quotes Bradley Smith in his book. Look, FICA is a bad law, but all the commissioners that I knew there did their best to try to enforce that law because they had taken an oath when they became commissioners to uphold the law. The claim that all of the votes that they make on the commission are party line votes is also demonstrably false. If you take a look at the history of voting on the FEC since the agency first came in 30 years ago, you will find that in enforcement cases, so these are cases where they're deciding whether someone has violated the law, the number of split votes, remember, it's a 6-member commission. There's 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats on there. The number of split votes where they can't make a decision is less than 1% of all cases. In fact, most of the cases are unanimous. So in terms of enforcing the law on a nonpartisan basis, whether the person in front of them is a Democrat, a Republican, a Libertarian, they don't vote on a party line basis, and the history of the FEC shows that. Now, where the split votes have occurred, and there were split votes when I was there, it has invariably been in areas of policy, new regulations, in areas where the law is ambiguous and unclear. And I can tell you that I and the other Republican commissioners I knew, whenever there was a place where we could actually vote a less restrictive view of the law, that was the vote we took. And what you saw and what I saw was there wasn't so much a party breakdown based on party lines and party loyalty, but it was just the fact that most of the Republican commissioners, there were exceptions, were less regulatory minded in the political area, and most of the Democratic commissioners were more regulatory minded in that area. I'll give you one more fact that I think demonstrates that the Republican commissioners don't like the FICA law and are not part of some kind of conspiracy to keep this law in place to try to keep the independent parties and other parties out of. I recently, along with 7 other former Republican commissioners who represent almost every Republican commissioner that served on it, we recently filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case, which, as many of you may know, is a case trying to get parts of the McCain-Feingold law declared unconstitutional as a violation of the First Amendment. We didn't file on the side of the FEC and the law. We all filed on the side of Citizens United, trying to convince the court that with our long experience, 75 years worth combined of enforcing this law, we said to the court, this is an unenforceable, confusing law, it's unconstitutional, you should overturn it. Also, the idea that, again, that Republicans are perfectly happy with this law and are part of some kind of Democratic conspiracy to keep it in, I think, again, is demonstrably not true. It's very true. Senator McCain is the poster child for this law, but he's almost alone on his side of the political aisle in supporting this law. When the vote came down in 2002, the majority of Democrats voted for this law in the House and Senate. Only a small minority of Republicans voted for it. The majority of Republicans voted against this law because they didn't like it. And almost all of the major lawsuits that have been brought to try to get this law overturned, Republicans have filed them, including 2 pending lawsuits right now, which are going up against the restrictions on the parties, which frankly, if they win the case, will help the independent parties also, because these laws are arguing, for example, about the restrictions placed on the parties for engaging in activity in state elections, like the elections going on in Virginia and New Jersey. Two other points, just briefly. I think we're running out of time here, right, John? Yep. First of all, the idea that having multiple parties instead of just 2 will somehow result in our solving the many problems we face today, like I said, I think is an optimistic assumption that doesn't really have a basis. Now, don't get me wrong. I think third parties and their candidates should be able to get on the ballot. I think they should be able to field candidates, and I'm hopeful that doing so will enliven the political debate and discussions that go on in this country. And I don't think any of the parties should be getting public funding of any kind. In fact, I recently wrote an article in Politico going against the latest proposal that's in Congress, been proposed by Senator Durbin, that would not only, we would not only have funding for presidential campaigns, but he's proposing funding for congressional campaigns. But look, there are numerous countries in Europe, such as Italy, that have multiple parties that split the reins of power. And they often find themselves unable to take any actions in terms of government policy that are at all controversial because they find it impossible to put together majority coalitions that can get anything done. The more parties you have sharing control of the government, I think the more difficult it is to have effective governance. I also don't like proportional representation in voting, and I disagree with the idea that requiring candidates in districts to win a majority of the vote is somehow a bad requirement for the democratic process. I think it's a good requirement. It means that candidates have to field ideas and solutions to problems that a majority of voters think is a good idea. The majority vote requirement forces candidates to try to build coalitions and deal with multiple interest groups, which I think creates better overall representation. Frankly, it also prevents individuals who have radical ideas that only a small minority of voters agree with from getting elected to positions where they may have considerable power to implement their particular views that the majority of Americans do not agree with. Thus, it can potentially prevent changes in economic, social, and government policy that go against the consent of the governed. And the consent of the governed is the most basic philosophical and political belief that this country is based on. Overall, I think this is a very informative book. It points out inequities in our laws that govern our election process that I think should be fixed. I would not agree with some of the characterizations contained in it, but I agree with many of the proposed solutions, such as simplifying ballot access and moving to a much less restrictive campaign finance system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hans. I'm sure the speeches we've heard today have given everyone food for thought and also prompted some questions. So we're going to have questions now. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come. And then when you get it, identify yourself, an organization you're involved with or your affiliation. And also, please direct a question to one of the people up here so that they can respond to it. Let's go with the gentleman down here. The microphone, please.
I'm Robert Steele. Is this working? From Virginia's 11th District. My question, and I regret that Jackie Salett and Cynthia McKinney are not here. It's an honor to be in a room with Ralph Nader and with all of you. Why can't we get everybody to play well together and take the ideas in Ralph Nader's book? There are 8 fundamental Electoral Reform Act principles. Why can't we get the Greens, the Libertarians, and the Independents to basically demand of Obama, as the price of anything in 2010, that he pass the Electoral Reform Act of 2009?
I'll assume everyone.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go, Jim.
Well, I have no problem with that. I think it's a wonderful idea. We just need to, open up. We need new choices and new voices. And actually, third parties, independent candidates do just what CATO is trying to do and what Heritage is trying to do. They're trying to increase the range of political debate. And, I'm not saying that the Republicans and Democrats don't, agree on everything, but the idea is they enforce conformity. And, if you want to move up into the national kind of role, you have to conform at the local level to get into the state level and so on and so forth. And the idea is we need a lot more choices and a lot more voices. That's the whole idea here.
Theresa?
This is on?
Yes, they're on.
Oh, good to meet you in person, Mr. Steele. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to say it's really minor parties and third parties and independents, they don't all have obviously the same platform. So they can get together and should get together on removing the systemic barriers to entry, but after that they will compete for the votes of the American people on their own and from their own ideological perspectives and their various platforms. It's really not their job to fix the entire electoral process. It's all of our jobs as citizens. And I want to make something clear so that we can percolate some questions here. I don't agree with most of what Mr. von Spakowski said and the solutions that have been proposed by either of these two gentlemen. I am for public financing of campaigns. I am for proportional representation and instant runoff voting. I am for choice maximizing systems on how we are able to select our candidates, and I'm not for corporations being able to dive bomb into people's districts and be able to finance particular candidates. I don't believe they hold the same rights that we do as individuals, and they certainly don't have the right to vote, at least not yet. So I hope that will help inspire some questions, and we'll talk about, because we certainly all don't agree on what the solutions are, even though some of us do agree on what the problems are. Yeah. Well, that's why people of all political stripes have to not just talk to people in their own cultural cul-de-sacs and come out and come talk at CATO or come talk at the other organizations that should host these kind of events. There are a number of organizations in this room, not only Christina Tobin's with free and equal elections, but there's also representatives here from Fair Vote, fairvote.org, and as well Citizens in Charge, the Citizens in Charge Foundation. There are a lot of organizations who are starting to work on these systemic problems, and I hope they will pipe up too.
You want to say something to that?
My only response to that proposal is good luck trying to convince the president to do anything that might diminish his re-election prospects in 2012.
This gentleman right here. We'll go to the right side of the room now.
Mr. Spakowski, my name is Spear Lancaster. Mr. Spakowski said too many parties might make it impossible to govern. And what I want to know is what's magic about two? Why not go for one?
Arguably, we have that.
I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. What I'm saying is I think the ballot access laws should be relaxed so that third and fourth and fifth parties can get on there. But the idea that will somehow magically solve many of the problems we have, I think is belied by the fact that you can look at plenty of other democracies that have multiple parties, and they face many of the same problems we do, and don't seem to be any better in finding solutions to them.
Let me use the privilege of the moderator to ask a question here. Is it, the experts here, do you believe that third parties and a larger role for third parties implies proportional representation, either just changing the system or also some voting procedure that would give you that? Or can you do it in a single member district?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to put this in context. You know, in the last 30 years, there's been a wave of democratization in the world, where we've had a lot of countries who weren't democracies or democratic republics or whatnot, who have chosen to become more democratic. And in that wave, not one has chosen to adopt the United States system. And we should ask why, because it doesn't provide the same kind of representation. I do believe we should have proportional representation and if we don't get there yet, choice maximizing voting systems or in combination thereof. Because, for example, how many people saw the front page New York Times article on Wednesday, October 7th, and they talked about New York City had an election, a runoff election, right? And in a city of 8 million people, almost nobody showed up to vote. 3 million registered Democrats, and you had some districts where actually nobody came to vote. But we can do better than this, and so maybe and I would start with the Constitution, because I believe we should start looking at things like the Electoral College, which are anachronistic now, and I know those might be fighting words here, but I'm happy to engage, and think about how we want to improve our system. Our system was, great maybe for the 18th century, but we are now in the 21st century, and there have been kinds of systems devised that can be applied, that can do things that can make the electoral system more reflective of the will of the people. At the end of the day, if you want consent to come from the governed, we have to look at how we vote and the systems in place that offer choices for who we can vote for in order to be able to maximize consent of the governed.
I'll second that. I think that's excellent.
Anything on that? Thanks very much. Now, let's go down front here with Christina and then the gentleman behind her.
Hello, my name is Christina Tobin. I'm the founder and chair of the Free and Equal Elections Foundation, the former National Ballot Access Coordinator for Ralph Nader 2008, and also the Libertarian candidate, seeking Libertarian nomination for California Secretary of State. My question is, currently an initiative in support of the top 2 primary is on the ballot in California for June 2010. Top 2 primary is in which the top 2 vote getters in the primary are the only names to appear on the November ballot, even if that means only one political party is represented. The top 2 primary is the biggest threat to the existence of minor parties in over 50 years, according to Richard Winger, that is, world-renowned ballot access expert. My question is, and also wanted to also also mention in Washington State, of almost 200 races, there were only 8 candidates that did not advance to the general election. I'm sorry, there are only 8 candidates that did advance the general election because they ran in unopposed races. In Washington State, they passed the top 2 primary in 2006. My question is, what is your position on the top 2 primary, and how do you think this will impact third-party and independent candidate races nationwide? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't like that idea, because I frankly think each of the political parties should have whoever their nominee is on the ballot during the general election. And like I said, the ballot access rules ought to be relaxed so you can do that. That's just kind of an extension of this kind of open primary system that some states have tried to put in, that can end up with 2 candidates from the same party being on the general election ballot and everybody else excluded. And I don't think that's a good idea, and I don't think that's the way we should be doing races. I have to say that for all of the criticisms given of parties and as factions and so forth, parties are simply an expression of a very fundamental right that's contained in the First Amendment, which is the right to associate with people who have the same beliefs and views that you do. And, you know, I don't have a problem with political parties. In fact, I think they're not that much different from other organizations that people belong to, like, you know, the Sierra Club or the National Rifle Association, because they represent issues that the people that are members agree with, and the political parties are like that. I do think we ought to have a system where people can form political parties easily, get on the ballot, and run their nominees for election. You know, if nobody votes for them, well, you know, then they don't have the ideas that the majority of voters like. But, you know, let voters make that decision.
Any comment?
Yes. Following up, you know, I think it was Pew that put out a study in May of 2009 that said we are at our highest point in 70 years for people self-identifying as independents in this country. I'm not for the top two idea. I think we ought to get away from the number two altogether here, because what is happening is that it's a funneling process, and what it does is it's very unlikely that an independent or third-party candidate would emerge in that top two. That kind of winnowing is exactly the opposite of what we should be trying to do, which is expand choice in the general election. And people should, you know, learn more about this system. But I don't want the media reducing choice. I don't want debate commissions or the parties, for example, how they kicked out Dennis Kucinich and Senator Mike Gravel, even in the two major parties winnowing choice. I want to make it possible that more people and more choices are in front of the American people and are able to participate. And that's why I think that the Federal Election Commission, going back, we need to view campaign finance laws, which I'm in favor of, more like tax policy, and we have to say we don't want it just not to have a corruptive effect, but we want to also look at how can government facilitate the participation of people, and how can, like good tax policy, we reward behaviors we want to see and discourage behaviors we don't want to see, and that we should use that mindset when we're looking at constructing the campaign finance laws.
Just a moment. We're going to run a little bit late because we got started a little bit late and because there's lots of interest out there. And I want to get to as many people as possible. I said yeah. Sorry.
With all due respect to Theresa,
Sorry?
The whole problem with having the extensive tax policy we have is because you have government bureaucrats deciding what social policy should be encouraged and what shouldn't. And I have to agree completely with what James Bennett said when he said the biggest problem in Washington is that the government is too big, too powerful, and that's why so many people spend so much time trying to influence to benefit them. And what is true for tax policy is also very true of federal campaign finance laws. Okay, look, the commissioners I served with on the FEC were all very well-meaning people, but they were 6 people over a federal bureaucracy of almost 400 individuals. And you do not want government bureaucrats making decisions on what kind of political activity should be encouraged or discouraged in the political arena. People should be freed to act as they want to and to speak as they want to. And I would say to you, compare the federal system with 2 states, Virginia, Utah, that have no restrictions on contributions. They do require disclosure. And Governing Magazine rates Utah and Virginia as having 2 of the best-run governments in the United States. And you tell me whether you think Virginia government is, or Utah state government, are they somehow much more corrupt than the federal government and the federal system? Most people in those states would tell you they think they probably have a cleaner government than the federal system.
I promise the gentleman behind Christina.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Rose. Actually, I live in Seattle, Washington, and one question was just asked. I want to go back actually to the question then, and I voted for Ralph Nader, and I'm still repenting for that sin. I
hope that's tongue-in-cheek.
I want to go to the question about voter turnout. A very elementary question. Is there a correlation between an increase of voter turnout and support for the third party and even some of the campaign finance reform versus if there are lower turnout? I mean, other than special every 4 years, high-profile elections, voter turnout in the United States is very, very low. And just want to add to Dr. Bennett's point, you mentioned Iran, which is a very good example. I believe Afghanistan had up to 28 candidates on their ballot, including some women. So I think it's a very good point. Thank you.
Any comments on that?
Well, you address this in your book, right?
Yeah, well, put it this way. If you honestly believe that there's not that much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, I mean, why vote? That's the point. And I think a lot of issues that should have been debated. Now, Ralph is very good at this. You may not agree with his positions, but the idea is he wants to put this stuff on the table and get it out there. And, people want to talk about this. He wants to talk about, labor issues and trade issues and things like that. And you don't really get this very much. Everything's clustered in the center, and the idea is to spread the ideas about. And, Hans has been talking about the fact that, if you have multiple parties, government may not be as easy, governing may not be as easy, and it may be different. Well, that may be a very good thing, frankly. I mean, you look at our government, how effective are these people anyway? I mean, talk about the SEC and the Madoff situation. You talk about, hey, we got the Federal Emergency Management thing and Katrina, and then there's always this thing called the United States Postal Service. I don't know where they get the service from, but nevertheless. And it may be a good thing to have less government and a less effective government. Now, we may be very fortunate we don't get all the government we paid for.